So Ben Eltham, again, I have adapted his bio at my will, is what I would describe as a proper smart Dr. Dude. He is a research fellow at Deakin University's Faculty of Arts and Education. He also writes for the masses, or at least those of us on the 112, 86 and 96, and is New Matilda's National Affairs correspondent and Arts Hub's industry columnist. He freelances in about, a dozen at least other places, let's say a lot of other places, and is a fellow at the Centre for Policy Development. Ben's interests include culture, policy and memory, and one thing you may not find on his bio, in fact you won't because I read it and put it in, is that he's uncovered some awesome arts industry scandals over the years, and I've decided he is our Bob Woodward. As such, I've nominated his theme song as Private Eyes by Hall & Oates. Please welcome him because he is watching you. Ben Eltham, ladies and gentlemen.
So, in his wonderful book, Land of Plenty, Mark Davis, the University of Melbourne academic, wrote a fascinating passage. Land of Plenty is his follow-up to his well-known 90s book, Ganglands, in which he notoriously or famously asserted that a group of baby boomers were holding back younger voices and younger generations from Australian culture. In Land of Plenty, he describes a walk from South Bank across the bridge, down to Flinders Street, through the alleyways and into the Nicholas Building. And he describes the shift in scale, the shift in vibrancy, the shift in imagination from the rather sterile environment he describes at South Bank of all of those large cultural institutions. Testing grounds hadn't got underway at that point. And then the difference or the diversity, the sheer energy that he experienced inside the Nicholas Building, which at the time was probably at the peak of its incubatory activity, if you like. And it's one of the most interesting passages, I think, in that book because he uncovers a fault line between the above ground and the underground in Australian culture that has, since that Mark Davis wrote that, become a very obvious fault line, a very important fault line indeed. And I think it's interesting to reflect upon that when we address a topic like the future of art, because it's an almost impossibly nebulous idea, isn't it? No one can predict the future, and yet sometimes we flatter ourselves that by extrapolating from historical trends or from the evidence we see around us, we can somehow predict what the future might look like. I don't think anyone could have predicted the future would look like, or the present would look like, the current scenario we face in federal cultural policy. It's one of the most interesting times to be an arts journalist in my career. Simultaneously, at a time when we've got a number of local and state governments developing really quite sophisticated cultural policies at a local government and state and territory level, we've also had one of the most dramatic retrenchments, indeed austerities, from the federal government in cultural policy in 40 years. Last Wednesday, I happened to be at the first hearing of the Senate inquiry into changes in Commonwealth arts funding, chaired by a noted Australian cultural figure, Glenn Lazarus. I think what was fascinating about the hearings that took place was the sort of sense that Australian art and culture, or certainly a certain sector of it, is at something of a crossroads. Speaker after speaker at those hearings described the vibrancy, just how exciting Australian culture was, particularly the opportunities opening up in fields that people wouldn't have thought possible. The efflorescence of independent dance in Melbourne, for example, is something that I think few people would have predicted 20 years ago. And yet there was also an overriding sense of foreboding, perhaps even of crisis, because of the scale, the magnitude, and perhaps the flow-on impact of the Australia Council funding cuts. So I think we are, at this moment, at a bit of a crisis, if you like, at a bit of a crossroads, a situation where things could go either way. At the same time that we've seen this austerity from the federal government, we have, as I said, seen local governments like Melbourne and indeed the City of Sydney develop some very interesting local government policies. And I think it behoves us to think about the different levels that culture operates at, both at a municipal level, on the street, even at the city level, but also in the large institutions funded by our states and our federal governments, but also, of course, in people's bedrooms, on their computers, and between their heads. I don't know what the future of art in Melbourne is going to look like, but I'm entirely encouraged by the newfound organisation and the newfound voice that the art scene seems to have developed in the wake of these funding cuts from Minister Brandis. It seems to me for the first time that the cultural industries in Australia are starting to employ a bit of their political muscle to try and change things on the ground for working artists. And I think that's probably a good place for me to leave off and to hear from some of the other artists that are here tonight.
Well. 4 minutes and 51 seconds. The gentleman gets a prize. I have small children. I am not above bribery. Thank you so much. I'll comment on what you said later. I'm sure everyone's heads are already buzzing. But I'd like to move on to our second speaker, Eleni Urbis. Eleni is one of our City of Melbourne representatives. She's the manager of the Creative Spaces program, which underwrites cultural production by brokering, letting, subletting and developing affordable space for the creative sector. In lay terms, she gets us spaces to work in. I literally work from my laundry/office in Reservoir, north of Bell Street, as we discussed recently. So I will definitely be chatting to her after this gig. Creative Spaces has been very successful and even won an Industry Institute of Architects Small Project Award. And if you're not familiar with it, you can check it out at creativespaces.net.au. In 2012, Eleni was nominated to participate in the Committee for Melbourne's 2-year leadership program, and prior to her current role, she worked as a film director and script writer. As someone who literally creates spaces for us to work in, I have chosen a theme song for you, Eleni, Little Room by the White Stripes. Aww. In my case, very, very little room. I think I've stressed that already. Please make her welcome, Eleni Urbis.
Okay, I'm Eleni Urbis. I manage the Creative Spaces program. Most people will have come into contact with Creative Spaces through our website. In fact, most people think Creative Spaces is a website. There are hundreds of listings of spaces that people can access for free, which they do. They log on, they find this space, they move in, they start creating art, and we pay for it. So, it has been a fantastic resource for us because obviously we understand what people are looking for, how much money they can afford to pay, and it informs the kind of developments we do. Inadvertently, around 2009, the program morphed into a bit of a not-for-profit development program. And we did that initially to demonstrate to the private sector what they could do with their buildings more than what council can do. At the time, there was lots of vacancy. It was a time when people were land banking, waiting for building permits to come through. So we took the opportunity to develop one of our buildings, short term, to say, instead of having a vacant building sitting there, populate it with artists for very little money, and you can be a great citizen, you can contribute to the creative output of the city, and fill that gap that is a bit of an eyesore to all our to Melburnians. What we discovered from that project is that we did do it. We did it for $28,000. Artists, 23 studios, they were meant to be there for 6 months. We've just entered our 6th year. Hundreds of artists have come through, established artists to graduates from VCA. But the thing that we learnt from that project was the private sector wasn't as willing to come to the table as we thought they would be. They kind of were a little bit scared of talking to artists. They weren't sure how they would ask them to move out when they needed the building back. So we decided to step up and take over the lease of a building, refurbish it, and sublet or license it to artists. And our very first project that was mentioned before was River Studios. And I'm talking quickly because I want to get to the project of the future, which is situated in South Bank, where all our key infrastructure is. I'll come to that in a second, but River Studios changed the game a bit for council. It was the first time a local government authority leased out 3,000 square metres of a vacant building, took the risk of refurbishing it, becoming a kind of leasee, and handing that over to artists. We did win an award for it. You know, we have artists there from established artists, from people like Callum Morton and Marco Fascinato to graduates. We've also entered our 6th year this year with River. But on the back of that, a few years later, we hit with the Melbourne Arts Precinct blueprint. And affordability, once again, came up. Now, the thing that always comes up with consultations, the creative conventions, is access and affordable space. But the thing about the Creative Spaces program is it isn't purely about that. It's about where can we seize an opportunity to embed creativity when the opportunity presents itself. So when the Arts Precinct Blueprint came along, and it looks fantastic. There's key infrastructure, it's close to the city, the river's there, there's bars, there's restaurants. It was kind of interesting to see why it wasn't working. And essentially the feedback that came back from you was, there's no space for independent artists, for smaller organisations, they're kind of fine grained, there's no public space that we can really activate. So, we kind of did a bit of thinking and went down to that neighbourhood to see what was there. And to our delight, there was actually 1,000 square metres of unoccupied retail space sitting at the bottom of a residential building. Hidden, like from the street. It doesn't look like this. This is a building that connects Sturt Street with Moore Street. It's basically a street in its own right. And the owner who had established it for retail space couldn't get the commercial return that he wanted. So for a year, that space had sat empty. So when we approached him to say, could we start a conversation about activating this, creating smaller practitioners in smaller spaces that connect with the bigger infrastructure here, contribute to the precinct. He was interested, but he was also interested in his commercial revenue targets. And this became a very delicate negotiation. So Creative Spaces, the City of Melbourne, partnered with Creative Victoria. We pulled some funding together and in collaboration with the owner have just managed to negotiate an amount of money that makes the vision for the site possible. So we are now moving forward, and I just want to briefly talk about that vision because hopefully within the next few months you will see this develop. We have run an expressions of interest. We have had great response. We're a few weeks away from actually being able to disclose who the successful tenants are because there are still boards to be notified and approvals to be made. But there is a fantastic mix of small festival organisations, national institutions, a cafe, some creative retail, creative spaces. That's 4:30, not 5, by the way. I got a special in. Oh, damn. Okay, and we're setting up an independent producers hub because we have such fantastic talent and we really want to nurture that and bring them together next to other art services. Anyway, I'm just going to quickly run through the space, public space. Because I work for the council. We're all about process. And that's an interior. Thank you. And keep
Moving on to the fabulous Tony Yap. Tony was born in Malaysia and is an accomplished dancer, director, choreographer and visual artist. He's one of the principal performers with IRAA Theatre and has worked pretty much everywhere. As the founding artistic director of Mix Company, now Tony Yap Company, in 1993, he's made a commitment to the exploration and creation of an individual dance theatre language that is informed by psychophysical research, Asian shamanistic trance dance, Buto, voice and visual design. Tony has received numerous nominations and awards, including a Green Room Award for Best Male Dancer. Tony received an AsiaLink residential grant to work in Indonesia in 2005, and in 2008 he received a prestigious 2-year dance fellowship from the Australia Council. He's the founding director of Melaca Arts and Performance Festival. He is, of course, as you would have just heard, a wicked underachiever. I'm thinking possibly a workaholic, so I'm giving him the theme song, He Works Hard for the Money, by Donna Summer. Please welcome Tony Yap.
I'm not very good at speaking, so I've written something and I've timed it, and it was exactly 5 minutes. Well, I wanted to introduce Melaca Arts Festival as a model that we actually recently started, that we didn't know where it's going to go, except that it was inspired by a trip that I went during my AsiaLink residency, and also a research into trance practices in Asia and how that affect my work as a contemporary performer. And in that process, I see a lot of independent artists in the region trying to just express and make work, and they are amazing, rare voices that comes from very traditional, very outside our postmodern urban area. And I thought about that background that I came from and how the connection came back. And so Melaca Festival started when I was just happened to talk to a manager of an event management company in Malaysia, and we were just talking in Malacca and said maybe we should start a festival here, being that at that time that UNESCO has given Malacca the heritage status, which means that, you know, it's going to be commercial so quickly, and then how are we artists going to go hand in hand and try to match that crazy, which actually happened. That was 7 years ago. So we started with the idea that we have platforms for these artists, these independent artists everywhere that actually do not have a space to go to, like unless you belong to a company, you know, you probably don't have a platform like that. And it was a simple site-specific kind of idea that actually grew. And what it is at the moment is, at the last festival we had 65 artists from all around the world, and it's also a corridor for a lot of Australian artists. So it became a festival where we don't bring people in for an idea, but it actually grew out. And so actually it's like a festival for actors and performers and artists to travel into Asia to the spots where they can perform. So it's so much more also for the artists as it is for the audience. And the audience is everybody. It's free from all, for all. And so you sometimes I sit down and I hear a lady say, a man who said, are you in the festival? I said, yes, I'm in the festival. He said, I watch it every year, and it's amazing. I've never seen anything like that in my life. And they are the people who actually wouldn't go to all these precincts that we have so available, because they are like art people who, so we bring the art to them, and we get amazing responses. And so we also challenge the artists to think about accessibility and to think about who their audiences are beyond what they already practice. And so that's a great challenge. And I think that's what, to me, Melbourne is for me, and also what I bring to Melbourne in a sense of my background and this bridge between these two areas. So Melaca Festival, we have shamans with bullwhips performing with a soprano opera singer from Brisbane, and we have, a hip-hop dancer with a contemporary ballet to the court dancers of Java. So it's a really interesting collaborative area. So it came up by itself, and so now we actually have 3 other sister festivals in Indonesia and in Melbourne. We call Mapping Melbourne, which is run on a budget of $5,000. And we have 17 artists performing, all paid. And also Delhi this year, in Mapping Delhi, which will be starting. And so it's becoming a kind of interesting observation of how things evolve, rather than we put an idea onto what things should be. So it is inclusive. It is a mixed pot, but at the same time, it has an integrity. It's not like a chaotic place. And I think that is because of the integrity of the artists who come to the area who want to work. So Melaca Festival is this. I just thank you very much. So